When we think about ways to improve online sales, we typically don't think about website speed. However, site speed can play a critical role in driving sales or driving customers away. We know that today's shopper waits for no one, and alternatives are a mere mouse click away. But can a site that loads slowly really be part of the reason why online stores lose sales? And if so, then what kind of boost to traffic or revenue can we achieve by optimizing our site's performance? I'm Jane Singer, and thank you for joining me here today on A Seat at the Table, where we get to hear from so many outstanding people who share their insights, experience, and expertise. It's great to have you as part of our international community that now includes industry leaders in over 100 countries. In this episode, I'm talking with Shawn O'Neill, founder of SpeedSense, a boutique consultancy and SaaS toolset company that helps enterprise brands lift revenue, improve customer satisfaction, and cut costs by running a faster website. SpeedSense has helped a client increase organic traffic by 35% simply by speeding up their website. They've also helped a client raise annual e-commerce revenue by over $5 million in a few months through site speed. There's a lot we can learn from Shawn, including why it's so difficult for e-commerce brands to run a fast website, what you need to prioritize so that your site is not only fast, but also engaging, and how reducing your back-end server pool can help reduce CO2 emissions and your carbon footprint. Before we get started, if you're a supply chain executive who'd like to finally put an end to information overload and get a concise, fact-based summary of key market developments and shifts, as well as sharp insights as to what is likely to impact sourcing in the coming months, then the current situation in sourcing is exactly what you're looking for. To learn more, head on over to thecurrentsituation.net. That's thecurrentsituation.net, where you can get all of the details. Now let's talk with Shawn about how to make our websites faster and how we can also reduce our CO2 emissions. I'm really interested in having you on the show, Shawn, because we don't often talk about some of the behind the scenes or under the hood aspects of running a website. So I think that what you're talking about is really interesting, and I think it's going to share some very important insights that most of us who are listening to this show haven't really thought about. Now, you talk about that, the importance of having a faster website. Assuming that your site isn't glacially slow, how much of a difference does it really make for most users for a 20% or even a 40% difference?
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. That varies greatly, that 20 to 40%. And I think first off, there's a big difference between explicitly perceiving a website as slow and subconsciously eroding your customer's experience of your brand with micro frustration with every touch point. And so, yeah, for sure, glacially slow is sort of that first category you talked about, where it's taking 10 seconds between when I click a button and when I see a response. Those are typically not the brands would already know if they're in that category.
Right.
They'd have their users telling them everyone in-house would be working on it. And often with the tier of clients with whom we work, they've overcome those kinds of hurdles earlier in their career or in their growth.
Okay.
But the second category there around micro frustration is really what we help focus on. So what we're trying to do here by building a fast website and by having even the fastest website on the internet, you're not magically going to slurp more money out of your customers' wallets or convince them to buy more than they would have otherwise purchased. We really just want to minimize opportunities for them to abandon your site and improve and deliver a delightful experience when they're browsing your website. And this, again, varies wildly from industry to industry. Like if you're selling concert tickets or, commodity that you can't get elsewhere, then a lot of times people will be very patient and potentially very frustrated and still buy their plane ticket or buy whatever it is from you if they have nowhere else to go.
Yeah, that's very true. And you're right. I mean, people do expect things instantly, and even, a nanosecond of a delay if you do have an alternative choice, you definitely will hop over there, or you may not browse to buy one more product. You'll only get the minimum that you absolutely need off that site, because you feel, like you said, you feel frustrated, dealing with something that is perceived as being painfully slow.
Yeah, or even subconsciously perceived as that way. It's just like, I don't think I'm going to go back there, and I don't really know why, but next time around I'm going to go to Walmart or Amazon, or just didn't really make me feel great. And so we do quantify that. We help brands model that relationship between milliseconds and dollars for their bottom line, by measuring the traffic on their site and improving the experience accordingly.
Right. Now, how does your company go about helping customers improve website performance? Well, like you said, you can reduce cost, you can boost sales, and so forth, without getting really, really super technical. But can you just walk us through a little bit about how you would go about finding the problems and how that might be solved on your side?
Sure. Okay. We focus largely on e-commerce brands, and I sort of alluded to that a moment ago, but didn't necessarily specifically call that out. But the same applies to anyone. If you have a landing page and you're trying to convince your B2B customer to sign up for your newsletter or something like that, it's the same idea. We often see that for e-commerce in particular, the marketing team's job is get people on the site. The operational team or e-commerce team's role and responsibility is turn those visits into dollars. And then there's a technical engineering or development team there to empower both of those teams to do their jobs. And so often site speed or slow site is a symptom of those teams not necessarily firing properly or collaborating properly. There's often, more to do than can be done by the team they have in-house. And so with site speed being such a difficult to quantify and nebulous subject, is really difficult then for the product manager whose job it is to prioritize web performance to say, this is more important than the other things in the backlog. This is more important than our next campaign landing page, for example. So we help with the prioritization and making a business case for that based on traffic and based on their competition. But then, tactically and really pull me out of the weeds if I get too deep here.
Okay.
We do a thorough audit of how every page loads, the order in which the files are loading. We really exacerbate the problem synthetically, as in with bots and
Right.
And fake scans, and we'll slow down the network, we'll slow down the CPU so that, if you can make it fast for a really bad network on a really bad device, it gets better from there for everyone else. And so we slow it down. We look at what the CPU is doing, the order in which the assets are being requested. I'm really in the weeds now, but there are strategies then to say, of these thousands of different pages and tens of thousands of different files, which ones really matter here? Where should we start? Where's the biggest, hurdle in terms of your users' conversion?
Right. I think that's interesting. And, you say it's getting into the weeds, and it is, but it's important. And oftentimes people focus so much on the front end and the visual appeal and things that are important, but in some respects negligible compared to the importance of how the back end contributes to user experience that a lot of people don't realize. They think, well, if we have beautiful graphics or we have some, funny animation on there or whatever, that's going to be fine. And it works fine in the demo because they're only using it over one particular browser experience or internet connection. And like you're saying, you have to be able to roll it out over almost not infinite, but a tremendous number of scenarios that your customers may be experiencing your site from. So I think what you're saying is really important.
For sure. You touched there just briefly on load as well,
Right.
Like capacity. And so there's a distinction between front end and back end performance, and typically front end performance is offloaded to the browser, so the user's device. And the more people you have on your site, they're all bringing a phone or a computer with them, so they have their own CPU. So that problem scales pretty nicely. But the more users you have on your site, they're all connecting to the same backend servers, and that is where capacity and load can become a bottleneck for web performance, for sure, in high load situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're looking at all these factors, and there are many, and I realize that maybe this is an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it. I'm going to ask it anyway.
That's your job.
Yeah, exactly right. Is there one that you would point to as causing the most problems typically?
As in a technical issue?
Yeah, I mean, when you're
Sure.
looking at is it more or less like load, or is it more or less speed? Where would be like typically the starting point? And like I said, I realize that there's many different scenarios, but
Okay.
yeah.
I can answer it. Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about how software development works, and how code gets deployed to the site. To ship a new feature, a product manager dreams up the features and functionality, the specification, basically. The developers do the development and the coding. The QA team validates that everything meets the acceptance criteria. And then the deployment or DevOps or, infrastructure team pushes that code to the production site. And so that takes a while. Typically from like idea to code is in front of the user, you're talking at best 2 weeks, often a month. And so a set of tools has come up, over the last couple of decades, really. This isn't new, but tag managers, Google Tag Manager, Adobe has a tag manager. These are basically little code boxes, little Trojan horses, I like to call them,
Right.
where a marketer can sort of circumvent that relatively long and slow moving process to deploy a piece of code to production in minutes or seconds.
Right.
And then with that great power comes great responsibility, as Spider-Man's dad would have us know. And so it's easy then for a marketer who has the best intentions, just has a mandate to get this function live in production, will be inadvertently circumventing all those checks and balances and gates that have been put in place very, very intentionally to maintain high quality for the website. And so it's very often we'll see a set of code that's maintained by the developers and rigorously tested, and then another separate set of code that lives in the tag manager that is, different triggers for different campaigns when they fire, some different third-party plugins and tracking scripts and things like that haven't necessarily gone through that same degree of validation, and that's often a place where we can see performance improvements as opportunities right away.
Right. That's really interesting. And your software tool set is able to get in there and work on that and make the necessary corrections?
Well, we can identify where things are being loaded from. Yeah.
Okay.
We typically, the teams with whom we consult manage the code themselves.
Okay.
And our engagement, we aim to leave them self-empowered to be able to run a fast website. So we help upskill the dev team. We bring them tools and practices for prioritization and validation. We aren't necessarily contributing code. I guess that's the only differentiation I want to make there is we don't do the development. We upskill the devs to be able to run that on their own so that they're not reliant on us forever after. There's a big difference between buying a fast website and building a team that can build and maintain a fast website forever.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very critical point of differentiation that companies need to address when they hit a certain critical size. That initially you can probably buy a fast website, but then at a certain point you have to be able to, as you're saying, be able to run it yourself. Now, what your company offers is both the consultancy side to help them identify the problems, but you also, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, provide on a SaaS basis a tool set that they can use, that their dev team can use to be able to figure out what the problems are, figure out how to fix them, and so forth. Putting it very simply, very untechnical explanation.
That's great. I'm glad that it's so digestible in a non-technical way, because that is exactly right. We have a process, and through that process, we uncover opportunities for improvement. But inevitably, brands can't necessarily action the findings as quickly as we can uncover them. And so we have a set of tools that helps them monitor their performance of their site against their competitors. It integrates with their Google Analytics to see how their user behavior is changing over time as they make these changes. And then for the next 6 to 12 months, they can roll out the changes and monitor their improvements to their first party site speed, how they rank against their competitors, and then how Google sees that perception of their site. Because we haven't even touched on this yet, really, but if you're competing for search traffic, web performance and site speed has a lot to do with, or is a ranking factor for your Google SEO rank.
Yeah, it's really interesting you brought that up, because I don't think a lot of people think about that. I think that the focus tends to be more on keyword and things like that. I don't think that most people realize the role, as you're saying, that speed plays in ranking.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and it's relatively new. I mean, in the last maybe 18 months or so, Google started to more explicitly tell us how site speed affects ranking and which metrics in particular they're looking at to determine whether a site is fast or slow. This is something they call the core web vitals. Previously, they'd sort of alluded to it, in the way that Google sort of hints at things being important, but
Right.
we don't really ever know. But I've been thankful that, for the last couple of years, they've really started to become clear on how site speed affects rank and what they're looking for.
Yeah, I think it's good that you brought that up. I think that, there's so many things we overlook. And granted, there are a lot of moving parts when you're talking about anything that's in a dynamic environment like a website, that it's hard to keep track of everything. And it's also, as you're saying, very difficult to understand very specifically what Google prioritizes. But you're right, speed is definitely a key part of that user experience that seems to be very important for companies like Google and others that pride themselves on being customer-centric or user-centric. So yeah, I think it's something we need to be aware of and need to be addressing. Now, you brought up something else I thought was really, you brought up something else that I thought was really interesting, and that will probably resonate with a lot of people listening to this, and that is how this can impact a company's carbon footprint. I mean, we don't often think of web development and carbon footprint in the same sentence. Can you talk about that? What do you see happening?
The use of energy is pretty tightly correlated with carbon generation. And so a website and the web in general, actually, I read a study last year that the internet as an industry produces more carbon than the entire airline industry, which to me was shocking.
Yes.
And so it's because, to move bytes around the world, and even for us to have this call right now and send data over the wire from Vancouver to Hong Kong, we've got a lot of computers between here and there. And
right.
All those computers are consuming electricity, and there are various ways in which that electricity is generated. And so for the speed of a website, there's sort of three factors that come into play to determine the carbon footprint. One is the servers themselves that are running the backend and where they're generating their power. The number of those servers to reach a certain capacity of peak load, like we talked about earlier, is relevant. You typically pool your server size. There's a couple of ways to do it, but historically, you would, budget for your highest traffic day of the year, and then give a little bit of overhead, maybe 10% overhead for year-over-year growth, and allocate that many servers in your pool. There are much more elegant ways to dynamically allocate servers nowadays, but that's basically the gist of it. So more back-end servers, more carbon.
Right.
The next tier would be getting that byte of data, every byte from the server to the client's device. And so really we're just passing messages along through different computers over the internet. Every router, every network connection is consuming energy, and that's a harder thing to quantify. The energy expenditure along the network path, and it's going to be more related to the payload that you're transmitting. So more bytes, more code, bigger images, bigger videos, all of that is going to have a higher network payload and therefore generate more carbon through its transmission. And then the third category is on device itself. So, the more code you deliver to a user's device, the more it has to decompress and execute that code and build the page, run the video, whatever the case may be. and that has a fall-on effect on battery degradation, on CPU utilization, and video cards and memory and everything on the client side. So they're very difficult to quantify, and some of that is carbon offset or carbon emissions for which the brand themselves can be responsible and have an impact on, and some of it is much harder to quantify, like how far away your customers are, for example, and how many network hops are happening.
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Right. I think that's interesting. It's something, like I said, that most of us don't really think about. And, when we're talking about carbon emissions, we never think about how much, like you're saying, is being generated by the use of electricity. I know the case has been made against cryptocurrencies because of the amount of energy that's needed to mine them. And I'm not an expert or even mildly knowledgeable about crypto, but I do know that case has been brought up. So if this is the situation with websites, how do you then reduce this carbon footprint? What are some of the basic steps people might take?
Sure. The best and quickest way to reduce the carbon footprint of your website would be look for database calls that aren't necessarily needed in a given page request. And so I can give an example from a company I used to work with where every time someone visited any page on the website, we would instantiate in our database a cart for them so that they could add wine as they shopped the website. It was a wine and spirits website. But a lot of those database requests were not necessary because 80% of the time nobody adds anything to their cart. They're browsing, they're understanding, and then they come back another time and they add something to the cart. And so most of it was there were a few opportunities there by no longer creating a cart for every page view or for every session. We didn't need as much database space. We could handle a lot more traffic on the back end because fewer calls were being made. And it's typically situations like this that would then let you peel back the number of servers you have running in the back end. I had another scenario with the client of SpeedSense that was very similar. They were doing an address book lookup every time you proceeded to your cart page, for example. So it was fetching all of your addresses, all of your order history, because often when these different flows are coded by developers, there's an existing function, for example, to get me the user. So then it goes to the database and gets that user and it said, well, if I'm going to get you the user, I may as well get you everything that user has ever done. And some of those database requests can be very costly in that they're not cacheable. They aren't the same request for 1,000 different users. It's going to be specific to that user. So the deeper you are in the shopping journey, the less cacheable the database requests usually are. And so the more expensive they are to make. And by reducing some of that, by only getting what you need, you can typically you can provide a lot less load to your servers and then therefore need fewer servers to serve as many users.
Interesting. It is really something that we don't think about, but important. Now, you talk about reducing carbon. I mean, how much? I know that it's different in every scenario, but ballpark, I mean, how significant of a reduction can we achieve in our carbon footprint by really attacking what's happening on the back end with our servers and data calls and so forth?
Oh, wow. Great question. I think the biggest place to start is if you have control over where you're buying your energy and where your server farm is running, you could choose renewables. So
interesting.
Yeah, there's a few databases that show, based on where your infrastructure is hosted, based on what your hosting provider is, whether the power that they've purchased is from renewable energy or from coal or something else. And so that is sort of like the hammer that alleviates most of it. But presuming you couldn't change that, I just talked a moment ago about the cacheability of certain pages. So imagine you've got a homepage and 1,000 different people are visiting the homepage at a time versus those same 1,000 people are in their checkout flow, like on the cart page.
Right.
For the homepage, they can all get the same instance of that page, presuming you're running no personalization and no experimentation. They don't necessarily all need to make a call to your database or your server at all to create the HTML that makes up that homepage. And so that would be a highly cacheable page, something that you could put in a CDN. You're pushing it closer to the user, so there's fewer network hops, and then there's also fewer database calls and back-end time just to generate that page. The deeper you get in the funnel, the less cacheable pages typically are. And it gets complicated when we get into inventory management and reviews and, things that are specific to things that are especially things that are changing rapidly. So highly cacheable pages are typically those with the fewest dynamic elements and the most static elements. Like a blog post is incredibly cacheable. But my specific prescription on the glasses website that I use is not cacheable. Like you wouldn't have the same one. Every user wouldn't have the same one. So there needs to be a database call for that.
Okay.
So to quantify that, I guess you could probably say, I bet you could cache half of the page views of a website so that there are half as many database calls. It would be a challenging endeavor, but we would start with the pages that are most cacheable based on least dynamic elements.
Right. Interesting. Like you say, it's something, it's something we just don't think about. And unless you really have your hands in the clay on this, it's an opportunity that's overlooked. And what I think is particularly relevant is you mention where you host your servers. And that's another thing that until you brought it up, I hadn't even thought about. And yet servers are always hosted, not always, but typically hosted remotely. So you do have that opportunity to host in an area where you have access to cleaner, greener, more affordable energy. And it's something that I hadn't even considered. And it's an important point. Like you say, it can make a sizable reduction.
Mm-hmm. I do find it a bit, I need to be careful to quantify this because often we'll talk then about improving the carbon footprint of an e-commerce brand who is then producing a product in Sri Lanka and shipping it to Mexico for assembly and then selling it in, Toronto. And so right. The carbon footprint of the website is really negligible in terms of the whole carbon effect of the entire brand or carbon impact. But for pure play digital brands, for SaaS companies, this could have a massive impact on their CO2 emissions.
Yes. Yeah, I can see how it definitely would be a bigger percent for, as you say, for pure play software. But even for people who are doing things that involve, multiple manufacturing sites and shipping and so forth, it's an interesting thing to look at. And it is an area because in many companies, they ask each department to try to contribute in their own way to reducing either CO2 or in some way moving the needle on sustainability. So this is something that the IT department could potentially work on, even though it might not be massively impactful on the company overall, but it is something that they could do if they were tasked with, well, how do we contribute to the company's overall sustainability metrics?
Totally. Yeah. And when we're talking about carbon, there's sort of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 being direct carbon that the brand is generating in their own operations, and then scope 2 and 3 indirect. And so whether they're hosting this site themselves and running their own servers versus buying energy and server time from another brand can change that calculation as well, and to what degree they're responsible for that emission.
Yes, yeah, I can see implications both positively and negatively with regard to that.
There's a few projects with whom we're collaborating, and this is really relatively new for the industry in general. The connection between carbon and web, it's in its infancy, and there are certain consultants that are for sure more versed in it than I. So I wouldn't say that that's necessarily our specialty, but it is the tooling that we've created to optimize site speed and web performance also is going to have a fall-on effect on CO2. And so it's something that's inextricable really from what we do now.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Shawn, you've shared a lot of really interesting things that I hadn't thought about before, that I was not aware of. So I'm sure so many people listening to this show are really finding this to be very enlightening. Now, where can people find you? How can they connect with you?
Great. Speedsense.com is where we reside online, and I'm most active on LinkedIn. So Shawn O'Neill, look me up on LinkedIn, and I'm love to connect.
Okay, well, I'm going to include all of your links in the show notes and, of course, over on our podcast website. So I really want to thank you for taking the time and for sharing so many insights and expertise.
Great, Jane. It was great to be here. It's fun to chat with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me here on A Seat at the Table. If you've enjoyed this episode or learned something from it, I'd love to hear about it. If you'd like to support the show, please hit the subscribe button. And if you can take a minute to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or other channels, that would be fabulous. And check out our podcast website, seatpodcast.com. That's SEAT podcast.com. You'll find all kinds of bonus content over there, including ebooks, productivity resources, and a preview of upcoming podcast episodes. And while you're there, take a look at Your Seat at the Table, a new podcast course that will show you step by step exactly what you need to do to land those prestigious guest spots on podcasts. Being a guest on a podcast is a great way to gain visibility and grow your authority. Your Seat at the Table gives you a detailed roadmap with templates to teach you exactly how to achieve this. So head on over to seatpodcast.com. And if there's something you'd like to share, ideas, suggestions, or comments, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for joining me today and being part of our international community. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in the next podcast episode.